The cheap, flesh-colored bandage on Pearl's cheek should have been just another invisible detail in an invisible life. As a delivery girl for Rapid Drop, Pearl C. Alexander had perfected the art of being a ghost in high-rise hallways, dropping bags, avoiding eyes, and disappearing before the door fully opened. But tonight, the heavy mahogany door of the penthouse didn't just open. It revealed Park Tae-suk. In the high-security silence of his compound, Tae-suk was a man who noticed the heartbeat of the city before it even pulsed. He stood there, an immaculate figure of white linen and dark ink, the rose tattoo on his neck a silent warning of the thorns beneath his skin. Pearl flinched, her shoulders drawing inward as she tried to hand over the thermal bag, a reflex of fear she'd learned from months of Evan Kroll's reminders. "Your change, Mr. Park," she whispered to the floor, her voice trembling. He didn't take the bag. Instead, he invaded her space without a sound, his fingers reaching out to lift her chin with a gentleness that felt more dangerous than a blade. The cool touch forced her eyes to meet his calm, focused, and burning with a suppressed rage that made the air turn cold. His thumb brushed the edge of the gauze on her cheek, where the foundation was 3 shades too light. "Who did this to you?" His voice was a deadly whisper, the same tone used to order the erasure of rivals. In that moment, the invisible delivery girl was finally seen, and the man responsible for her bruise had just signed his own death warrant. Park Tae-suk did not move his hand. He kept his fingers hooked under Pearl's chin, forcing her to endure the weight of a gaze that had made hardened lieutenants crumble. The silence in the penthouse was absolute, broken only by the distant hum of the city 30 floors below and the frantic, shallow rhythm of Pearl's breathing. I tripped on the stairs, Mr. Park," she stammered, the lie tasting like ash. "The bag is getting cold. I should go." A shadow of a smile, cold and devoid of humor, touched Tae-suk's lips. "You are a terrible liar, Pearl Alexander." The sound of her full name coming from his lips hit her harder than a physical blow. She froze. In the 3 years she had lived in the city, she was a number, a username on an app, a ghost in a uniform. "How do you know my name?" Tae-suk finally released her, but he didn't step back. He turned slightly, his gaze drifting to the bookshelf behind him, where the leather-bound volumes were aligned with surgical precision, except for one section. "You think because I am rarely here when you arrive, that I do not see you? I have watched you through the lens of my security feeds for 6 months. I have watched the way you enter a room as if you were trying to apologize for taking up oxygen." He walked toward a crystal vase on the side table, where a cluster of wildflowers sat in stark contrast to the minimalist decor. "You brought these 3 days ago. You thought I wouldn't notice the change, just as you thought I didn't notice the way you hum that specific jazz melody when you think the hallway is empty. Or the way you spent 20 minutes reorganizing my history collection because the chronological order was off." Pearl felt a flush of heat rise to her neck, shame mixed with a terrifying realization. She wasn't invisible. She had never been invisible. This man, a king of shadows, had been studying her like a rare manuscript. "I notice everything in my domain, Pearl," he whispered, turning back to her. His eyes dropped to the bandage again, his jaw tightening so hard the rose tattoo on his neck seemed to shift. "I noticed when you started wearing long sleeves in 90-degree weather. I noticed when your humming stopped 2 weeks ago. And I noticed the tremor in your hands tonight when you reached for the door handle." He stepped back into her personal space, his presence an inescapable wall of heat and authority. "The man who did this, the man you are so afraid of that you would rather lie to a monster like me than speak his name, he thinks you are alone. He thinks no one is looking." Tae-suk reached out, his thumb grazing the very edge of the bandage, his touch devastatingly light. "He is wrong. I have been looking at nothing else for half a year. And I do not like it when people touch what belongs in my sight." Tae-suk's hand dropped from her chin, but the reprieve was short-lived. His gaze, sharp as a glass shard, traveled down the length of her arm to where her fingers gripped the strap of her delivery bag with white-knuckled intensity. Pearl tried to pull back, to tuck her hand behind her hip, but the movement was too slow. In one fluid motion, Tae-suk reached out. He didn't grab her, he simply intercepted her retreat, his palm sliding beneath her wrist to turn it upward into the light of the chandelier. Pearl let out a small, sharp gasp as he pushed back the cuff of her uniform jacket. There, marring the skin above her pulse, was a constellation of dark, ugly marks. They weren't from a fall. They weren't an accident. They were 4 distinct, localized points of pressure, the unmistakable crimson mark of a man's grip. The bruises were fresh, a deep, angry purple that told a story of a struggle Pearl had barely escaped. A fall, Tae-suk repeated, his voice dropping to a register that made the hair on the back of Pearl's neck stand up. He traced the largest bruise with the tip of his finger, his touch so light it was almost a caress, yet she felt the lethal energy vibrating through him. Funny. I've broken enough bones to know exactly how much force it takes to leave a print like this. These aren't the marks of a stumble, Pearl. They're the marks of a man who thinks he owns you. Pearl's eyes welled with hot, stinging tears she refused to let fall. The shame was a physical weight, heavier than the bag on her shoulders. It's none of your business, Mr. Park. Please. I just want to go home. Home. Tae-suk's jaw tightened, the dark rose on his neck seemingly blooming with his rising temper. Is he waiting there? Is that why your heart is hammering against my thumb like a trapped bird? Because you're calculating how many minutes you have before he starts checking the clock. He leaned in closer, invading the space she used as a shield. The scent of expensive cologne and cold steel enveloped her. For the first time, Pearl realized that the man in front of her wasn't just observing her trauma. He was absorbing it, transforming her pain into a cold, calculated directive. You aren't going back to that, he whispered, his eyes locking onto hers with a finality that brooked no argument. The man who put his hands on you tonight made a fatal mistake. He thought you were invisible. He didn't realize that by marking you, he was leaving a trail straight to his own grave. Tae-suk didn't let go of her wrist. Instead, he began to lead her deeper into the penthouse, away from the door and the life of shadows she had occupied. You're staying here tonight. And tomorrow, we start the process of making sure Evan Kroll never has the chance to touch you again. The heavy door of the penthouse didn't lead to an exit, but deeper into Tae-suk's world. He didn't ask for her consent. He simply moved with a quiet, magnetic authority that made the idea of leaving feel like stepping back into a storm. Within 20 minutes, Pearl found herself sitting in the back of a sleek, black sedan, the city lights blurring into long ribbons of neon. She felt small against the hand-stitched leather of the seat, her delivery backpack resting at her feet like a relic from a life she was rapidly losing touch with. They arrived at Era, a restaurant that wasn't just exclusive, it was a fortress of glass and gold. As they entered, the staff didn't just bow, they exhaled a collective breath of focused tension. The air here smelled of sandalwood and expensive wine, a far cry from the exhaust fumes and cold cardboard of Pearl's daily route. Tae-suk led her not to a hidden corner, but to the center of the room, a table set under a chandelier that dripped with light. When he pulled out the chair for her, Pearl hesitated, her hands smoothing over the polyester fabric of her uniform. Mr. Park, I can't sit here. Look at me. I'm working. Tonight, you are not working, Tae-suk said, his voice a low vibration that seemed to anchor her to the spot. He placed a hand on the back of her chair, his body leaning slightly over hers, a silent barrier against the rest of the world. Tonight, you are a guest in my house. And in my house, you do not hide. As the courses began to arrive, delicate, artistry-laden plates that Pearl was almost afraid to touch, she found herself pinned by his unwavering attention. He didn't check his phone. He didn't look at the other patrons. He watched her. He watched the way she tasted the truffle risotto with a mixture of wonder and guilt. Why are you doing this? She whispered, her voice cracking under the weight of the luxury. I'm just the girl who brings your food. Taesuk set his glass down, the crimson wine catching the light. The girl who brings my food is a ghost who thinks she has no value. But the woman sitting across from me has a spine made of iron and eyes that have seen more than most of the men who work for me. He reached across the table, not to touch the bruise this time, but to simply rest his hand near hers. Stop looking for the exit, Pearl, he commanded softly. For once, look at what is in front of you. You aren't a delivery to be made. You are the guest of honor. For the first time in years, the learned invisibility that had been Pearl's only armor felt like a shroud she was finally ready to cast aside. Under the golden lights of Era, she wasn't a victim or a worker. She was a woman being seen by a man who saw everything. The golden warmth of the restaurant offered a safety Pearl hadn't felt in years, but as the meal slowed, the weight of the secret she carried began to press against her chest. Taesuk sat back, his dark eyes never leaving her face. He didn't push, but his presence was an open invitation for the truth, a silent promise that he could handle whatever she was about to say. He wasn't always like this, Pearl began, her voice barely a whisper, her eyes fixed on the tablecloth. In the beginning, Evan was the man who promised to take me away from the noise. He was charming, attentive. He made me feel like the center of his world. She let out a shaky breath, her fingers tracing the rim of her water glass. But the world he built for me turned out to be a cage. It started with comments about my friends, then my clothes. Then he lost his job, and the center of his world became a target for his frustration. Taesuk's expression remained a mask of controlled stone, but the grip he had on his wine glass tightened until his knuckles turned white. Evan, he repeated, the name sounding like a curse in his mouth. Evan Kroll. Pearl nodded, a tear finally escaping and tracing a path down her cheek. I tried to leave 3 times. Every time, he found me. He said that if I ever tried to disappear again, he'd make sure no one would ever recognize me. That bandage. He did that because I was 5 minutes late with dinner. He thinks he owns the air I breathe, Mr. Park. He thinks I'm his property. The admission hung in the air between them, heavy and raw. Pearl looked up, expecting to see pity or perhaps the judgment she had feared for so long. Instead, she saw a fire in Taesuk's eyes that terrified and comforted her all at once. It was the look of a man who had just identified his next target. Evan Kroll believes he is a king because he has spent his life breaking a woman who is far stronger than he will ever be, Taesuk said, his voice dropping to a deadly, rhythmic calm. He reached across the table, his hand covering hers, his thumb stroking the bruised skin of her wrist with a chilling promise. He thinks you are alone. He thinks the shadows will hide his cowardice. But he has forgotten one thing. The shadows belong to me. He leaned forward, his face inches from hers, the dark rose on his neck vivid under the chandelier. He will never touch you again, Pearl. From this moment on, Evan Kroll is a ghost. He just doesn't know it yet. Taesuk stood up, the chair scraping against the marble floor with a sound like a whetstone against a blade. He didn't look at the other patrons or the staff. His world had narrowed entirely to the woman trembling before him. He pulled a heavy, gold-plated phone from his pocket and tapped a single command. Within seconds, a man in a dark suit appeared from the shadows of the foyer, bowing low. "Secure a suite for Ms. Alexander at the hotel upstairs," Taesuk ordered, his voice devoid of emotion. "And find me the current location of Evan Kroll. I want him breathing for now." Pearl reached out, her fingers grazing the fine silk of his sleeve. "Mr. Park, please. He's dangerous. If he thinks I'm with someone like you, he will do nothing," Taesuk interrupted, turning back to her. He reached down, his hand cupping her face with a gentleness that felt like the eye of a hurricane. The dark rose on his neck seemed to pulse with the rhythmic tension of his jaw. Evan Kroll has spent his life speaking the language of a coward, inflicting pain on those who cannot fight back. Tonight, he is going to learn a new dialect. A language only men of my world understand. It is a language of silence, of debt, and of finality. He leaned in, his forehead almost touching hers, shielding her from the curious eyes of the restaurant. By sunrise, the name Pearl Alexander will be a forbidden word in his mouth. He will forget you exist, not because he chooses to, but because the alternative will be a price he cannot pay. You are no longer his prey, Pearl. You are under the protection of the man who owns the shadows he hides in. He signaled to the waiter to bring her coat, draping it over her shoulders with possessive care. As he led her toward the elevator, his phone vibrated in his hand. A location had been found. Tae-suk didn't need to check the map. He knew every alleyway and basement in this city where a man like Evan would go to feel powerful. Go upstairs, eat, and sleep, he commanded softly as the elevator doors began to slide shut. I have a conversation to start. And unlike the ones you've had with him, this one will be the last. The doors closed on his silhouette, a man of immaculate white and hidden violence walking back into the night to settle a debt that had been written in the bruises on her skin. The hunt had begun, and for the first time in her life, Pearl wasn't the one being hunted. The morning sun filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the hotel suite, but the light brought no warmth to Pearl. The luxury that had felt like a cocoon the night before now felt like a gilded cage. A sharp, rhythmic knocking at the door pulled her from a restless sleep, and when she opened it, she wasn't greeted by Tae-suk's devastating gentleness, but by the cold, sterile badges of two detectives. The interrogation took place in the hotel's private conference room, a space of glass and steel that felt uncomfortably like an aquarium. The detectives didn't ask about her delivery route or her rent. They asked about Evan Kroll. They told her that Evan had been found in the early hours of the morning, wandering the docks in a state of catatonic shock, unmarked physically, but so psychologically broken he couldn't remember his own name. We know he had a history of domestic incidents with you, Ms. Alexander, the lead detective said, leaning over the polished table. But we also know whose car you got into last night. Park Tae-suk doesn't do charity. If he's protecting you, he's not doing it out of the goodness of his heart. Do you have any idea what kind of man you're dealing with? Pearl felt a cold dread settle in her stomach. She had seen Tae-suk as a savior, a man who noticed the bandage and the bruises when the rest of the world looked away. But as the detective spoke of criminal connections, extortion, and unsolved disappearances, the reality of the rope he had thrown her became clear. It wasn't just a lifeline, it was a tether to an underworld she didn't understand. Tae-suk hadn't just removed Evan, he had erased him using a machinery of terror that operated outside the law. When the police finally left, frustrated by her silence, Pearl found Tae-suk waiting in the hallway. He looked as immaculate as ever, his white shirt crisp, the dark rose on his neck a silent testament to his nature. They're gone, he said softly, stepping toward her. Pearl instinctively took a step back, her back hitting the cold glass of the wall. The movement mirrored the way she used to flinch from Evan, and she saw a flash of genuine pain cross Tae-suk's face. You didn't just help me, did you? She whispered, her voice trembling. You destroyed him. And now the police think I'm part of whatever this is. Tae-suk reached out, his fingers hovering inches from her face, respecting the boundary she had suddenly drawn. I told you I would use the language he understood. The police deal in evidence. I deal in consequences. You are safe, Pearl. That is the only reality that matters. Safe? Pearl looked at him, really looking at the man behind the refined mask. How can I be safe when the man protecting me is more terrifying than the man I was running from? Pearl fled the hotel as if the gold-leafed walls were closing in. She didn't take the car Tae-suk offered. She didn't even take the thermal bag she had arrived with. She ran until the air turned cold and the scent of expensive sandalwood was replaced by the familiar, gritty smell of rain on asphalt and exhaust fumes. She returned to her cramped studio apartment, a space that felt like a sanctuary only because it was the only thing in the city that belonged to her. For the next 3 days, she tried to force her life back into its old shape. She picked up double shifts at the delivery agency, pedaling her bike through the rain until her lungs burned and her legs felt like lead. She kept her head down, avoiding every dark car that slowed near the curb, her heart leaping into her throat every time a man in a suit crossed her path. She told herself that the silence from Evan was a gift, a clean slate, but every time she looked in the mirror at the fading Bruise, she didn't see a survivor. She saw a debt. She tried to find comfort in the mundane, the steam from a cup of cheap instant coffee, the rhythm of the city's evening rush, the quiet anonymity of the service entrance. But the learned invisibility that had once been her armor now felt like a shroud. She found herself looking at the empty space in her kitchen where she used to hum jazz, and the silence was deafening. She realized with a pang of terror that once someone like Tae-suk truly sees you, you can never go back to being a ghost. She was terrified that his world, a world where problems were erased and men wandered the docks in catatonic shock, would eventually consume her. She feared that by accepting his protection, she had merely traded one shadow for another, deeper one. Yet, as she sat in her dark apartment, the rent due and the rain drumming against the thin glass, she realized the most frightening thing of all wasn't the danger Tae-suk represented. It was the fact that for the first time in her life, she felt cold because he wasn't there to stand between her and the wind. She was a girl from a world of struggle, and he was a king of a world of blood. She tried to convince herself that the distance was for the best, that a collision of their lives would only end in her destruction. But as the fourth night fell, the simple life she had fought so hard to reclaim felt like a hollow lie. She wasn't running from Tae-suk, she was running from the terrifying possibility that she might actually want to be found. The rain had turned into a steady, rhythmic drumming against the thin glass of Pearl's studio, a lonely sound that matched the hollow ache in her chest. At 2 a.m., the street below was silent, the neighborhood drowned in shadows. When the knock came, 3 slow, deliberate raps, Pearl didn't jump. Deep down, she realized she had been waiting for it. She opened the door to find Tae-suk standing in the narrow, dimly lit hallway. He looked nothing like the untouchable king of the Century City penthouse. His silk shirt was damp from the rain, clinging to his shoulders, and his dark hair was disheveled. The controlled, effortless authority he usually wore like armor had cracked, revealing a raw, exhausted humanity beneath. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other. The air between them was thick with the scent of ozone and the unspoken tension of the last 4 days. "I try to stay away," Tae-suk said, his voice raspy and stripped of its usual deadly calm. He didn't wait for an invitation. He stepped into the small, cramped room, his presence immediately making the walls feel like they were closing in. "I told myself that you were right, that my world would only bring you more bruises. I tried to go back to the way it was before I noticed the flowers in my vase or the melody you hummed in my kitchen." He turned to face her, his eyes searching hers with a desperate intensity. "But the silence in that penthouse is deafening now. My empire, the thing I spent 15 years building through blood and ruthlessness, it feels like a tomb. I have everything, Pearl, and yet I found myself sitting in the dark, waiting for a delivery that would never come." Pearl leaned back against her scarred kitchen counter, her heart hammering against her ribs. "You're a dangerous man, Tae-suk. You break people. You broke Evan without even blinking. How am I supposed to live with that?" Tae-suk stepped closer, invading her space with a vulnerability that was more terrifying than his rage. He took her hand, his thumb tracing the fading yellow ghost of the bruise on her wrist. "You don't have to live with my world. I'm trying to learn how to live in yours." He bowed his head, his forehead resting against hers, a king surrendering his crown. "I've spent my life being feared, but I've never been seen. Not until you looked at me. Please, don't go back to being invisible. Not to me." In the quiet of the 2 a.m. rain, the distance between their 2 worlds vanished. Pearl realized that while she had been running from the monster, the man had been the one who was truly lost. She reached up, her fingers trembling as she brushed a damp lock of hair from his forehead, finally allowing herself to be found. Would you like me to finish the story with the final chapter, the most visible thing, where we see their transformation years later? The golden hour in Century City always felt different from the balcony of the penthouse. Years ago, Pearl had arrived here with a heavy backpack and a heart full of shadows, looking for an exit before she had even stepped inside. Today, she stood at the railing, the wind catching the silk of her emerald dress, looking out over a city that no longer felt like a hunting ground. Evan Kroll was a ghost from a different lifetime, a name that hadn't been whispered in years, erased so thoroughly that sometimes Pearl forgot the girl who had once used cheap foundation to hide her pain. She wasn't that girl anymore. The learned invisibility had been replaced by a quiet, unshakable presence. Pearl now ran Alexander Logistics, a firm built on the ethics of dignity and fair pay, a sanctuary for workers who, like her, had once been overlooked by the world. She had taken the capital Taesuk offered, but she had provided the vision, turning his shadow empire's efficiency into a legitimate force for good. A familiar warmth settled against her back as a pair of arms wrapped around her waist. She leaned into the crisp scent of bergamot and the steady, grounding heat of Taesuk's chest. He had changed too. The sharp, jagged edges of the Mafia boss had been smoothed by the peace they had built together. He had stepped back from the underworld, his conversations of shadows replaced by the intricate, demanding work of a legitimate restaurateur and a partner. "The sunset is different tonight," he murmured, his voice still a low vibration that anchored her. He turned her in his arms, his fingers, once feared by the entire city, brushing a stray lock of hair from her face with a reverence that never faded. He looked at her cheek, where the skin was clear and glowing, his thumb tracing the spot where the bandage had once lived. "I still regret it," he whispered. "That I didn't see you sooner. That I let you walk through my doors for 6 months before I truly looked at you." Pearl smiled, reaching up to touch the dark rose tattoo on his neck, no longer a symbol of violence to her, but a mark of the man who had seen her when she was a ghost. "You saw me exactly when I needed to be found, Taesuk. And you've seen me every day since." In the city that had once taught her to be small, Pearl C. Alexander was finally, irrevocably visible. She wasn't a victim, a delivery girl, or a secret. She was a woman who had survived the dark to claim the light. As Taesuk kissed her softly, the city lights below began to twinkle like a sea of stars, but for the first time in her life, Pearl wasn't looking for a place to hide. She was already home.